It'll be so much easier once we're all living here together, my daughter-in-law announced at the family reunion, smiling as though my home already belonged to her. Everyone around the picnic table laughed softly and nodded like this was wonderful news. Even my son raised his beer bottle with a grin. I just sat there holding my paper plate in both hands, staring at the potato salad I suddenly couldn't swallow. The late afternoon sun reflected off the lake behind them, turning the water gold, and for one strange second, I felt like I was watching someone else's family sitting in my backyard instead of mine. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes the people closest to you can become strangers overnight. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and until that Saturday in July, I thought grief was the hardest thing a woman could survive. My husband Richard had been gone for almost 3 years by then. 42 years of marriage reduced to an urn on the fireplace mantel and an empty chair at the kitchen table that I still couldn't bring myself to move. But grief is honest. Betrayal is something else entirely. The family reunion had been my idea. Every summer, Richard and I used to host everyone at our lake house in Vermont. The house sat on 3 quiet acres beside Lake Champlain. With cedar siding, Richard painted himself every spring until arthritis stiffened his hands. We built this place slowly over 30 years. One paycheck at a time. One repaired window at a time. One sacrificed vacation at a time. The screened porch still smelled faintly of the varnish Richard used during his last summer alive. I spent the entire week preparing for the reunion. I washed every guest sheet, trimmed the hydrangeas lining the walkway, made Daniel's favorite peach cobbler from scratch, even though peeling peaches made my wrists ache these days. I wanted everything to feel warm and familiar. I wanted my family to feel like family again. Daniel arrived first with Vanessa and the kids just after noon. My granddaughter Sophie jumped out of the SUV holding her phone in one hand and barely glanced at me before walking inside. My grandson Tyler gave me a quick side hug without taking his earbuds out. Vanessa stepped onto the gravel driveway wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored linen outfit that looked too expensive for a casual family barbecue. "Eleanor," she said brightly, air kissing near my cheek instead of actually hugging me. "This place looks even bigger than I remembered." At the time, I thought it was an odd thing to say. Now I realized she wasn't admiring my home. She was evaluating it. Daniel carried in 2 coolers and barely met my eyes. "Hey, Mom," he muttered distractedly before checking his phone. My son used to walk through this house like it was his safe place. As a little boy, he'd run barefoot down the dock before sunrise just to fish beside Richard. He used to beg us not to leave every August when summer ended. But standing there that afternoon at 41 years old, he looked less like my son and more like a guest waiting for a hotel room key. The reunion itself seemed normal at first. My sister Carol arrived with her husband. My nephew Greg brought his new girlfriend. Children splashed in the lake while music played softly from the outdoor speakers Daniel installed for me 2 Christmases ago. I remember standing at the grill brushing barbecue sauce onto chicken breasts while everyone laughed around the picnic tables. For a few hours, I let myself believe things were okay. Then Vanessa stood up with her wine glass. Before dessert, she announced cheerfully, "Daniel and I have exciting news." Conversations quieted immediately. I turned from the grill slowly, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. Vanessa smiled at me first. That should have warned me. "After months of discussion," she continued, "we've decided it makes the most sense for us to move here into the lake house with Eleanor." Applause broke out around the table before I even fully processed the sentence. My sister Carol clapped first. Greg whistled. Someone said, "That's wonderful." I looked at Daniel instinctively, waiting for him to correct her somehow. Waiting for him to say they had discussed the idea with me privately first. Waiting for him to look uncomfortable. But my son simply smiled down into his drink and nodded once. Like this decision had already been finalized somewhere without me. Vanessa kept talking. "The kids need stability, and honestly, this house is just too much for one person now. We'll help maintain everything, and Eleanor won't have to be alone anymore." Too much for one person. The words settled heavily into my chest. I stared at the people around my table eating from plates I had prepared, sitting in chairs I had carried outside myself that morning, smiling as though they were witnessing an act of generosity instead of a quiet invasion. "And with Daniel working remotely now," Vanessa added, "there's really no reason for this beautiful space to go unused." Unused. I nearly laughed at that. Every inch of that house contained my life. Richard's fishing jackets still hung near the mudroom door. His old radio still sat on the garage workbench exactly where he left it before the stroke. I still watered the roses he planted for our 25th anniversary every morning before coffee. But to Vanessa, my home had become square footage. Opportunity. Potential. I realized then that this conversation had happened long before that afternoon. The children weren't surprised. Carol wasn't surprised. Even Daniel's silence felt rehearsed. Only I had arrived at my own family reunion unaware my future was being announced like a vacation itinerary. "Well," Vanessa asked finally, smiling directly at me. "Aren't you excited?" Every eye turned toward me. The lake breeze moved softly through the trees behind them. Somewhere down near the dock, a wind chime Richard bought in Maine years ago rattled faintly against the porch. I remember noticing the smallest details in moments like that. The sweat running down my spine beneath my blouse. The smell of charcoal in the air. The way Daniel still wouldn't look directly at me. I smiled carefully and set down the serving tray in my hands. "That certainly sounds like quite a plan," I said softly. Vanessa beamed like she'd won something. "I knew you'd understand," she replied immediately. That was the moment I understood my daughter-in-law had mistaken kindness for weakness for years. She thought silence meant surrender. She thought grief had made me fragile. She thought growing older meant becoming invisible inside my own life. And maybe part of me had allowed everyone to believe that. Richard used to warn me about it sometimes. "You spend so much time making things comfortable for other people," he'd say gently, "that one day they'll forget the comfort came from you." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Sitting there at that picnic table watching my family casually divide up my future without asking permission, I realized my husband had understood something about people that I never wanted to believe. Vanessa raised her glass again. "To new beginnings," she said brightly. Everyone cheered. Everyone except me. I lifted my lemonade and smiled politely, while something cold and sharp settled quietly into place inside my chest. Then I watched my daughter-in-law pull folded floor plans from her purse and spread them across my picnic table like she already owned the house. After everyone left that evening, the house became quiet in the way only old houses can. Not empty, not peaceful, just quiet enough for every memory to feel louder. I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing barbecue sauce from serving trays while the grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily behind me. Richard used to wind that clock every Sunday night before bed. Even after all these years, I still expected to hear his footsteps crossing the hardwood floor whenever the house settled after dark. I dried the last plate slowly and looked through the window toward the lake. The picnic tables were still outside beneath the string lights. Half-empty lemonade glasses sat beside crumpled napkins fluttering in the evening breeze. Vanessa's floor plans were still folded neatly at the end of the table where she had left them, as though she assumed they belonged there now. I should have thrown them away immediately. Instead, I walked outside barefoot and picked them up carefully. My name was written across the top page in thick black marker. Eleanor Sweet. Not bedroom. Sweet. Like they were designing a small corner for an aging relative inside a house that no longer belonged to her. I carried the papers back inside and sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour reading through them. Vanessa had labeled every room. Sophie's room. Tyler's gaming area. Daniel's office. Family media space. There was even a note beside the garage about converting Richard's old workshop into a fitness room. I stared at that line the longest. Richard's tools were still hanging exactly where he left them. His fishing hats still rested on the wooden shelf beside the workbench. The old coffee mug he used for loose nails still sat beside the vise. Vanessa had walked through my husband's life and seen storage space. Around 10 o'clock, I heard footsteps upstairs. Daniel had decided they would stay overnight instead of driving back to Connecticut. He used to ask permission before staying here. Now he moved through the house confidently, like someone testing ownership. A few minutes later, he appeared in the kitchen wearing sweatpants and carrying a bottle of water. "You still awake?" he asked casually. I folded the floor plans without answering right away. "Apparently I live in a suite now," I said softly. He gave a tired little laugh. The same nervous laugh he used as a teenager whenever he wanted to avoid conflict. "Mom, do not make this into something negative. Vanessa is just trying to plan ahead." Plan ahead. Such harmless words. "Did either of you think to ask me first?" I asked. Daniel leaned against the counter and sighed heavily. "We are worried about you here alone." I have lived alone for 3 years. Exactly. He said it gently, but the words still landed like an insult. I looked at my son carefully then. Really looked at him. The silver beginning near his temples. The tension around his mouth. The impatience hidden beneath his calm expression. He suddenly reminded me so much of Richard during the years when money was tight and stress followed him home from work every night. Except Richard never made people feel disposable when he was afraid. This house is too much for you now, Daniel continued quietly. The property taxes alone are insane. The repairs. The winters. We can help maintain everything. Everything. Another strange word. He spoke as though the house itself was the burden. Not me. Not grief. Not loneliness. Just maintenance. And where exactly would I fit into all of this? I asked finally. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Vanessa thought maybe the downstairs guest room would be safer for you eventually. Fewer stairs. The downstairs guest room. The smallest bedroom in the entire house. I almost smiled at the absurdity of it. 42 years building a life beside my husband only to be gently relocated like old furniture. Daniel glanced toward the staircase before lowering his voice. Mom, try to see this practically. Families live together all the time now. It just makes sense. I folded the floor plans once more and slid them across the table toward him. You should get some sleep, I said calmly. Tomorrow is a long drive. He looked relieved by my lack of emotion. That hurt more than the conversation itself. My own son expected resistance so strongly that silence felt like permission to him. After he went upstairs, I sat there another hour listening to footsteps move across the ceiling above me. At one point, I heard Vanessa laughing softly in the room that used to belong to Richard and me. I barely slept that night. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying and walked downstairs to make coffee. The lake outside the kitchen windows looked gray and still beneath the early fog. Richard used to love mornings like that. He would stand on the porch holding his coffee mug with both hands and say the lake looked like brushed silver before sunrise. I still reached for 2 mugs sometimes without thinking. Old habits do not disappear just because someone dies. I had just poured cream into my cup when I heard footsteps upstairs again. Vanessa entered the kitchen already dressed for the day in white athletic clothes that probably cost more than my first car payment years ago. She smiled brightly when she saw me standing there. You are up early, she said casually, opening my refrigerator without asking. I watched her remove egg whites, almond milk, and fresh berries I bought for the reunion. She moved through the kitchen with unsettling confidence. Not rude exactly. Worse than rude. Comfortable. I have always been an early riser, I replied quietly. Vanessa nodded while scrolling through her phone. Honestly, this kitchen is going to look amazing once we open this wall up. She pointed directly toward the dining room without even looking at me. Natural light is everything now. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. Open what wall? Between the kitchen and dining room. She smiled again like we were 2 women discussing curtains together. Daniel agrees the space feels dated. Dated. That wall had photographs marked into its paint from 40 years of family birthdays and Christmas dinners. Richard measured Daniel's height against that doorway every September before school started. The small scratch near the baseboard came from the toy train Daniel crashed into it when he was 6 years old. Vanessa saw old construction. I saw my life. I imagine renovations are expensive, I said carefully. Well, if we sell the Hartford house, it should cover most of it. She finally looked directly at me then. And eventually this place will be a real investment for the children. The children. Not me. Never me. I realized something cold in that moment. Vanessa was not speaking about sharing my home temporarily. In her mind, the transition had already happened. I was simply the final detail waiting to be moved aside politely. Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later still wearing yesterday's t-shirt. He kissed Vanessa on the forehead before pouring himself coffee. When he noticed the silence between us, his expression tightened immediately. Everything okay? He asked. Vanessa answered before I could. I was just telling Eleanor about some ideas for the house. Daniel hesitated. Maybe we should slow down a little on that stuff. His voice sounded tired, but not protective, like a man trying to manage tension rather than defend his mother. Vanessa laughed softly. I am only brainstorming. Then she turned back toward me. By the way, Sophie absolutely loves the upstairs corner bedroom. My stomach tightened. That bedroom had belonged to Richard and me for 38 years. The upstairs corner bedroom. I repeated quietly. Vanessa blinked once, realizing too late what she had said. Oh, I just meant eventually. Obviously, eventually. There it was again. The language people use when they are waiting for your life to shrink quietly around them. Daniel stared into his coffee cup instead of looking at either of us. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. A stranger can disrespect you, but silence from your own child feels like agreement. Later that afternoon, after they finally packed the SUV to leave, Sophie hugged me quickly near the front porch. Mom says my room is going to overlook the lake, she said excitedly. She promised I could paint it sage green. I froze for half a second before forcing a smile. Did she? Sophie nodded innocently. Dad said you probably would not use the upstairs much anymore anyway. Children tell the truth adults accidentally leave lying around. I stood in the driveway waving goodbye while Daniel backed the SUV down toward the road. Vanessa rolled down her window just before they pulled away. We should probably start moving some boxes next weekend, she called cheerfully, just to get organized early. I smiled politely and waved until the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees. Then I walked back inside the house slowly and locked the front door for the first time in nearly 3 years. The following week felt strangely quiet, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I used to enjoy after family visits. It felt watchful, like the house itself knew something had shifted inside it. I started noticing small things I normally would have ignored. Daniel called twice in 3 days asking questions he had never cared about before. How old was the water heater? Had I renewed the homeowner's insurance yet? Did I still use the upstairs attic? His voice sounded casual each time, but underneath it was the careful tone people use when gathering information without wanting to seem obvious. Vanessa texted me links to modern kitchen designs one afternoon while I was trimming roses beside the front walkway. Just inspiration, she wrote with a smiling emoji. One of the photos showed white marble counters replacing warm oak cabinets almost identical to mine. I stared at the picture longer than I should have. Richard built those cabinets himself during the winter Daniel turned 12. Every Saturday morning for 3 months, sawdust covered the kitchen floor while he measured each piece twice before cutting once. He was proud of those cabinets. He used to run his hand across the wood like a man petting something alive. To Vanessa, they were outdated. To me, they still carried fingerprints invisible to everyone else. Thursday morning, I drove into town for groceries and stopped at Miller's Hardware to pick up birdseed for the feeders near the dock. The cashier, a young man named Ethan who had worked there since high school, smiled when he saw me. Your daughter was in here yesterday asking about paint samples for the lake house, he said casually while scanning my items. I looked up slowly. My daughter, blonde woman, tall, really nice. Vanessa, I felt something cold move through my stomach. She said you were remodeling soon. I forced a polite smile and paid for the birdseed without correcting him. By the time I reached my car, my hands were trembling hard enough that I dropped my keys once in the parking lot. That evening, I walked through the house room by room without turning on the lights. I do not know why. Maybe I needed to remind myself that everything inside still belonged where it was. Richard's leather chair still faced the lake windows in the den. The faded quilt his mother made in 1978 still rested folded over the guest bed upstairs. The hallway still smelled faintly of cedar every summer because of the old linen closet near the stairs. I stopped outside Richard's workshop in the garage and rested my hand against the doorframe. The room looked exactly as he left it. Fishing tackles sorted neatly in small plastic bins. Yellow work gloves hanging beside the pegboard. His old radio resting near the window. I could almost hear him humming softly while repairing one of Daniel's broken bicycles years ago. Then I noticed something strange. One of the shelves had been cleared. Not completely, just enough space for storage boxes. I stood there staring at the empty section for several seconds before remembering Vanessa wandering through the garage during the reunion weekend. This whole area could become a gym, she had said lightly while looking around. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I understood she had already been planning where my husband's memories would be relocated. I sat down on Richard's old workshop stool and suddenly remembered something he told me the year before he died. We had been sitting on the porch during a thunderstorm watching rain move across the lake. Promise me something, he said quietly. Do not let anyone pressure you out of this house after I am gone. I laughed back then because the idea seemed ridiculous. Who would pressure me? Richard did not answer immediately. He just stared out toward the water with that thoughtful expression he wore whenever something bothered him deeply. People change around property, he finally said. Especially family. At the time, I told him he worried too much. Sitting alone in that workshop years later, I realized my husband had seen the storm long before I ever noticed the clouds. Saturday morning arrived with heavy gray clouds rolling over the lake. I woke early and baked blueberry muffins mostly out of habit. Richard always loved rainy mornings because they made the whole house feel smaller and warmer somehow. By 9 o'clock, I heard tires crunching across the gravel driveway outside. I looked through the kitchen window and saw Daniel's SUV followed by a rented moving trailer. My stomach tightened immediately. They were not bringing a few boxes. Vanessa stepped out first wearing leggings and a baseball cap, carrying a clipboard in one hand like she was supervising contractors instead of arriving at her mother-in-law's house uninvited. Daniel climbed out more slowly, avoiding eye contact before opening the trailer door. "Morning," Vanessa called brightly as she walked toward the porch. "We figured we would get a head start before school starts again for the kids." A head start, as though this had already been mutually agreed upon. I opened the front door before she could let herself in with the spare key Daniel still had from years ago. "I was not aware today was moving day," I said calmly. Vanessa gave me a surprised look that felt almost theatrical. "Oh, we are only bringing some storage items for now. Nothing major." Behind her, Daniel and Tyler were already unloading plastic containers from the trailer. My son did not ask permission. He did not even pause. He carried the first stack directly toward the garage like a man returning to property he already owned. I stepped aside silently and watched them move through the house for the next 2 hours. That was the strangest part. Not the boxes themselves. The confidence. Vanessa instructed people where furniture should eventually go while standing in my living room drinking iced coffee from my refrigerator. Sophie walked upstairs carrying framed posters for the bedroom she had apparently already claimed. Tyler asked Daniel where they planned to mount a television in the den. At one point, Vanessa opened my linen closet and frowned. "We are definitely going to need more storage space once everybody is here." Everybody. The word echoed through me like a quiet eviction notice. I stayed polite. I even helped carry 2 smaller boxes into the mudroom when Vanessa complained about her back hurting. Years of motherhood train women to prioritize peace long after peace stops protecting them. Around lunchtime, I noticed Daniel carrying several boxes into Richard's workshop. I followed him quietly into the garage. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked softly. Daniel looked startled for half a second before recovering. "Just temporary storage." He slid another box beside Richard's workbench while speaking. The cardboard container blocked the lower cabinet where Richard kept his fishing gear. "This room has plenty of unused space." Unused. That word again. I stared at the boxes stacked beside my husband's tools and suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. "Your father spent more time in this room than anywhere else in the house," I said quietly. Daniel sighed heavily like a man dealing with unnecessary emotion. "Mom, I know this is hard, but things change. Things change." Such simple words for something so cruel. A few minutes later, I walked back toward the kitchen and froze near the hallway. Vanessa and my sister Carol were standing near the staircase, speaking in low voices. Neither realized I was there yet. "Honestly," Vanessa whispered with a short laugh, "once Eleanor adjusts, this place is going to feel completely different." Carol hesitated. "You just have to be patient with her. She is old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. I stood there silently listening to the women discuss my future like I was an aging relative already halfway absent from the conversation. Then Vanessa said something that settled coldly into my chest forever. "The important thing is getting established before she changes her mind." I stepped into the hallway then. Both women jumped slightly when they saw me standing there. Vanessa smiled immediately, too quickly. "We were just talking about organizing the upstairs." I smiled back, just as politely. "Of course you were," I replied. Then I walked past them calmly toward the porch while rain finally began falling against the lake outside. The rain continued through most of the afternoon, turning the lake dark and restless beneath the gray sky. By 5 o'clock, the moving trailer was finally empty. Boxes lined the mudroom walls. Plastic storage bins filled half the garage. Vanessa even placed decorative baskets beside the staircase as though she had already started redesigning the house around herself. I moved quietly through all of it, saying very little. That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. Around dinner time, Daniel suggested ordering pizza because everyone was too tired to cook. Vanessa agreed immediately and started listing toppings while sitting comfortably at my kitchen table, wearing one of Richard's old flannel shirts she had apparently found upstairs. The sight of it nearly stopped me cold. Richard wore that shirt every fall while chopping wood beside the lake. The sleeves were still frayed near the cuffs because he refused to throw it away no matter how worn it became. "Oh," Vanessa said casually when she noticed me looking at it. "I found this in the upstairs closet. It is so cozy." Cozy. I stared at the fabric hanging loosely around her shoulders and suddenly understood something important. Vanessa did not hate me. Hate requires emotional effort. What she felt was entitlement. She saw my memories the same way she saw the kitchen walls or the old furniture. Objects waiting to be rearranged around her preferences. During dinner, everyone talked about school schedules and mortgage rates while rain tapped steadily against the windows. I barely spoke. Halfway through the meal, Sophie glanced up from her phone. "Mom says we are going to have movie nights in Grandpa Richard's den once we live here full-time." Vanessa smiled proudly. "It is such a perfect family room." Family room. Richard spent his final winter in that den wrapped in blankets watching old baseball games because climbing stairs became difficult near the end. I could still picture the exact spot where his reading glasses rested on the side table during his last week alive. "And Tyler wants to turn the boathouse into a game room eventually," Vanessa continued. "There is so much wasted potential on this property." Wasted potential? Daniel nodded absent-mindedly while chewing pizza. Not once did he correct her. Not once did he look uncomfortable hearing his father's home discussed like an investment project. Then Tyler said something that silenced the table completely. "Dad said Grandma probably will not stay here forever anyway." The room went still. Even the rain outside suddenly sounded louder. Tyler looked down immediately after speaking, realizing too late that he had repeated something private. Vanessa forced a quick laugh. "Tyler, honey, that is not what your father meant." But nobody moved. Nobody smiled. Daniel stared down at his plate while rubbing the back of his neck nervously. Finally, I spoke quietly. "What exactly did your father mean?" Daniel exhaled heavily before answering. "Mom, do not do this." "Do what?" My voice remained calm. "Ask a question?" Vanessa jumped in quickly before he could answer. "Daniel is only worried about you being isolated out here long-term. We all are." There it was again. Concern wrapped around control so neatly that objecting almost made me sound unreasonable. I looked around the table slowly then. At the boxes already stacked against my walls. At my grandchildren casually discussing future renovations. At Vanessa sitting comfortably in my husband's shirt while planning movie nights in his den. Then I looked at Daniel. My only child. The little boy who once cried because he thought thunderstorms would scare me when Richard traveled for work. He still would not meet my eyes. And in that moment, something inside me shifted quietly into place. The grief disappeared first. Then the confusion. What remained felt colder. Clearer. I suddenly realized I had spent weeks trying to understand whether they were intentionally pushing me aside. But the truth was worse than cruelty. To them, this transition already felt normal, natural, logical. They had convinced themselves my life was simply making room for theirs. I folded my napkin carefully beside my untouched dinner plate and stood up from the table. "I think I am tired," I said softly. Vanessa smiled immediately, relieved by my lack of confrontation. "You should rest. We can organize more tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" She said it so confidently. I smiled back politely. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Tomorrow should be very interesting." The next morning, I woke before anyone else and sat alone on the screened porch with a cup of coffee while mist drifted across the lake. The house was still quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood settling beneath the damp air. For the first time in weeks, I felt strangely calm. Not because things were improving, because I finally understood what was happening clearly enough to stop lying to myself about it. Richard used to say confusion keeps people weak longer than pain does. He was right. Pain at least tells the truth. Around 7 o'clock, I heard Vanessa moving around upstairs. Cabinet doors opened. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Then music started playing softly from someone's phone in the kitchen. My kitchen. I remained on the porch another few minutes listening to strangers settling themselves into my life. Oddly enough, that was the moment I stopped feeling hurt. Something colder replaced it. Not anger exactly. Clarity. When I finally walked inside, Vanessa was standing barefoot at the counter arranging flowers into one of my glass pitchers while Sophie scrolled through decorating ideas on a tablet nearby. "Good morning," Vanessa said brightly. "I hope you do not mind." The hydrangeas outside were drooping after the rain. I looked at the flowers for a moment. Richard planted those hydrangea bushes for our anniversary 20 years ago because I once mentioned loving the blue ones growing outside a bed and breakfast in Maine. Vanessa cut them without asking because, to her, beauty existed to be rearranged. "They look lovely," I replied calmly. She smiled with visible relief. I think my silence had started unsettling her slightly. People expect resistance when they know they are crossing boundaries. Calmness makes them nervous because they cannot measure it. Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later carrying a stack of folders. "I was thinking," he said casually while pouring coffee, "maybe we should all sit down this afternoon and talk about logistics moving forward." Logistics. Another harmless-sounding word covering something ugly underneath. "What kind of logistics?" I asked quietly. Vanessa answered immediately. "Just practical things. Storage, room assignments, renovation priorities. We should really start planning before fall. Room assignments. In my own house." I nodded slowly as though considering the idea seriously. "That sounds reasonable," I said. Daniel looked surprised by how easily I agreed. Vanessa practically glowed. The atmosphere around the kitchen shifted instantly after that. They relaxed. Daniel stopped looking tense. Vanessa began talking openly about replacing carpets before winter and repainting the upstairs hallway. Tyler asked whether the internet signal reached the boathouse. Sophie started discussing where she wanted string lights hung in her room. They had expected emotional resistance. Instead, I gave them cooperation. And cooperation made them careless. Around noon, while everyone busied themselves unpacking more boxes, I quietly drove into town alone. I told Vanessa I needed more groceries. She barely looked up from measuring cabinet space when I left. The drive into Burlington took nearly 40 minutes because of road construction along the highway, but I did not mind. It gave me time to think. The closer I got to town, the calmer I became. By the time I parked outside Whitmore and Associates Legal Services, my hands were perfectly steady. The building looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago when Richard first brought me there to sign estate paperwork after his father passed away. Dark brick, brass lettering beside the glass doors, flower boxes beneath the windows. I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. Richard trusted only one person outside our family completely. His attorney, Leonard Graves. The receptionist recognized me immediately despite the years that had passed. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said warmly. "Mr. Graves will want to see you right away." I smiled politely and removed my sunglasses slowly. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I think it is finally time." Leonard Graves looked older than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp behind thin silver glasses. He stood the moment I entered his office and held both my hands gently for a second before speaking. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "Richard would not like the fact that you are here alone." Something about hearing my husband's name spoken aloud in that office nearly cracked the careful calm I had been holding together all morning. Leonard motioned for me to sit while his assistant brought coffee in delicate white cups that reminded me of funerals and legal meetings and all the moments in life people never truly prepare for. "Tell me what is happening," he said. So I did. Not dramatically, not emotionally. I simply described the last few weeks exactly as they unfolded. The family reunion announcement, the floor plans, the boxes arriving, Vanessa discussing renovations before even asking permission, Daniel standing silently beside it all. Leonard listened without interrupting once. But the deeper I got into the story, the more his expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. That unsettled me more than anything. When I finally stopped speaking, he leaned back slowly in his chair and removed his glasses. "Richard was afraid something like this might happen one day," he said quietly. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" Leonard opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a thick dark blue folder with my husband's handwriting across the tab. "Richard Whitmore Estate Documents." My chest tightened immediately at the sight of it. Leonard placed the folder carefully on the desk between us. About 6 months before Richard passed away, he made several changes to his estate structure. My heartbeat slowed strangely, like my body already understood something important was coming. He never told me. He specifically asked me not to unless it became necessary. Leonard opened the folder slowly, revealing pages covered in legal notes and signatures I recognized instantly as Richard's. The lake house and surrounding property were transferred into a protected family preservation trust. I frowned slightly. A trust? Leonard nodded. Legally, the property remains entirely under your lifetime control. No one can sell it, transfer ownership, renovate major portions, or establish residency without your direct written authorization. A strange silence settled over the room. Daniel cannot touch the property? Leonard gave a small, tired smile. Not only can he not take ownership while you are alive, Richard included a very specific clause. He turned several pages before sliding one document toward me. Any beneficiary who attempts coercion, manipulation, or forced relocation against you forfeits all inheritance rights connected to the trust permanently. I stared down at the words without speaking. The office suddenly felt very still around me. Richard added the clause after a meeting Daniel attended 3 years ago. Leonard continued carefully. Your son asked several questions about property valuation and future ownership timing shortly after Richard's diagnosis became public. My stomach turned slowly. You think Richard suspected this? Leonard folded his hands together. I think your husband understood people very well. I looked back down at Richard's signature near the bottom of the page. The same careful handwriting that used to leave grocery notes beside the coffee maker every Sunday morning. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Calm, practical, protective. Leonard slid another paper toward me. There is more. I looked up slowly. Vanessa contacted a local real estate consultant 2 weeks ago regarding estimated renovation value increases on lakefront properties in your zip code. My chest tightened immediately. How do you know that? Because she contacted a firm connected to our office. Leonard's expression hardened slightly for the first time since I arrived. Eleanor, they are not preparing to live with you temporarily. They are positioning themselves for ownership. Ownership. The word no longer shocked me now. Somehow that hurt worse. I sat there silently for several seconds while rain tapped softly against the office windows. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered anymore. What happens if they move in any way? Leonard looked directly at me then. That depends entirely on what you allow. I lowered my eyes back toward Richard's signature again and suddenly understood something that made my pulse steady completely for the first time in weeks. My husband had already seen this coming, and unlike me, he had prepared for it. I drove back to the lake house just before sunset with Leonard's folder resting quietly on the passenger seat beside me. The sky over the water had cleared after the storm, leaving long streaks of orange light across the lake. Normally, evenings like that made the house feel peaceful. That evening, it felt different, sharper somehow, like I was finally seeing everything without the soft blur of denial. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed another moving truck parked near the garage. My grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. They had not waited. Vanessa stood near the front porch directing 2 young movers carrying furniture inside, while Sophie filmed something on her phone. I remained seated in the car for several seconds watching strangers carry pieces of another family's life into my home. Then I noticed what they were moving. A king-sized mattress, Daniel's office desk, storage cabinets. This was no temporary arrangement anymore. They were settling in permanently before I even returned from town. Vanessa spotted my car first and smiled brightly as I stepped out. Perfect timing, she called cheerfully. The movers got here earlier than expected. Earlier than expected. As though any of this had ever been discussed with me honestly. I walked toward the porch slowly while one of the movers squeezed past carrying framed family photographs into the house. Vanessa followed me inside, speaking quickly. We figured it made more sense to do everything at once instead of dragging it out over weeks. Everything. Again that word. The hallway looked completely different already. Stacked boxes lined the staircase. New rugs leaned against the wall. Someone had moved the antique cedar bench Richard built years ago away from the front window to make space for shoe racks. I stopped walking when I reached the den. Vanessa had changed it completely in less than a day. Richard's reading chair had been pushed into the corner beside the bookshelf. The old wool blanket he used every winter was folded carelessly across an ottoman. Tyler's gaming equipment covered the coffee table with tangled cords and glowing monitors. Tyler needed a quiet setup for school. Vanessa explained casually behind me. Teenagers need their own space now. Their own space. I stared at Richard's chair shoved into the corner like leftover furniture and felt something inside me become perfectly still. Not broken. Settled. There is a difference. Daniel entered the room, carrying another box just then. Hey, Mom, he said cautiously. We thought getting the heavy stuff done now would be easier on everybody. Easier on everybody. Nobody in that house spoke directly anymore. Every sentence wore politeness like camouflage. I looked at my son carefully. Did you ever intend to ask permission? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. We thought you understood the plan. The plan. Not a conversation. Not a request. A plan. Vanessa stepped forward before I could answer. Eleanor, nobody is trying to upset you. We are only creating a better situation for the family. I almost smiled hearing that. The family. As though I somehow existed outside the definition now. Sophie walked into the room, holding her phone up excitedly. Mom, should I post the moving video tonight or wait until everything is finished? Vanessa brightened immediately. Post it tonight. The lighting is beautiful right now. Then she glanced toward me and laughed softly. Everybody online is obsessed with lake houses lately. Sophie grinned and turned her phone screen toward me. The video thumbnail showed my porch at sunset with bold white letters across the image. Our new beginning. I stared at those 3 words quietly while something cold settled deeper inside my chest. Not because they hurt anymore. Because they confirmed everything Leonard had told me. Vanessa had already announced ownership publicly before a single legal conversation ever happened. That is a lovely title, I said calmly. Vanessa smiled, relieved again by my composure. I knew you would come around eventually. Come around. As though acceptance was inevitable once old people stopped resisting reality. I nodded slowly and walked upstairs without another word. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh